Welcome, Susanne. I'm Dustin Breitenwischer, and I'm having the pleasure of interviewing Susanne Rohr, Professor of American Studies at the University of Hamburg, today. And Susanne, I want to dive right in. We have 10 minutes. And your talk is entitled The Aesthetics of Madness. And of course, when we talk about the aesthetics of madness, numerous images, numerous tales, narratives come to mind. The Gothic tale that Ras Castronova was talking about, but of course also the disturbing and degrading images of female hysteria, early photographic images. You are mainly focusing on contemporary narratives of mental illness, of aesthetics of madness. For the sake of an introduction, could you give me and the audience somewhat of a diachronic comparison of how your material, your archive relates to the greater cultural history of an aesthetics of madness and mental illness?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, the interesting element here that we have to realize is, I think, that we have an interesting mixture of a very old tradition that we see that is being followed by newer productions and the introduction actually of a new category. And what I am talking about here is that we have an age-old meaning going back to antiquity, iconography of madness. How madness is usually or has been depicted over the centuries, we can say. There are certain elements. How do you visualize that which in a way defies being visualized? Mental illness. So there's a certain iconography that is in place, and we can still see that. Even in the more modern productions, we see that this iconography is still in place, like tattered clothing and wild hair and, wide open eyes and sort of certain gestures that are significant, to sort of represent mental illness. And on the one hand, then, we have recent artifacts that still follow this iconography very seamlessly. So, and that is so interesting. We have films where you really see that in place. We have novels where mental illness is depicted. We have paintings, all this is still in place. It's age old. It's really since antiquity. You can see it's a continuity of this iconography. But the point that I make in my talk is that in the more recent productions that we have a new category that is added, and that sort of enriches this age-old iconography, and that is the category of autism, that suddenly as a mental illness becomes center stage. And the point that I make in my talk is that I ask, why is this so? How can we relate this to the present cultural, social, political scene, that this category becomes so important these days? And of course, because it's a new category, new aesthetics, and that's the point. That's the relation to the topic of the conference. These films employ a new aesthetics, a sedate, a calm aesthetics, where we follow the sense-making processes of the autistic personalities that have great trouble making sense of the world and relating and communicating with the outward world, with other human beings. And we see that in a way, the mise en scène of that, So that's the interesting point that I see, that we have this new category, because the old categories, when I speak about categories, is, for instance, the mentally ill people seen as beast-like, very dangerous, almost animal-like creatures, or we have the wise fool, who plays an important role, particularly in the Middle Ages, or we have the gifted genius, sort of the mad genius, the mad artist. These are categories that we have, but this is then a new category.
Yeah, and it seems that and today, in today's depiction, that you talk about something else is kind of picked up, but then again also changed, transformed, and that is the moment you said the wise fool, the mad genius. Those are all figures that function outside of the social, outside of let's say, more common forms of communication, more, let's say, communal forms of politics, and so on and so on. And I want to stay with the idea of the contemporary, which I find really fascinating in your talk and your project, is the idea where you say that you refer depictions of autism and that can we say, it's not a mental illness, but I would say behavioral disposition to, let's say, Ulrich Beck's idea of individualization in our globalized modernity. And you make an interesting twist. You say the representation of such conditions, such as autism, marks a normalization of the behavioral deviant. At the same time, characters in films who are depicting or who are depicted as autistic, or who are not being depicted as autistic but who behave in a quasi-autistic way, have to make sense of this new, let's say, modernity, this new way of social instability, social incoherence, economic destabilization, and so on and so on. And you talk about the social, or you just talked about the social. And so what I'm drawing at is, can we link this, and I just dare say you are a pragmatist thinker. How can we relate this moment of an aesthetics of contemporary, or in contemporary aesthetics of madness, mental illness, as a social practice to, let's say, a pragmatist aesthetics that decidedly pinpoints the aesthetic as that which is representative of greater social communication and so on? What do we learn from an aesthetics or aesthetic representations of such mental illness about our contemporary society?
Yeah, I think what these movies that's my primary material, show us is sort of they visualize in a way an epistemological dimension, i.e., and what I mean here, epistemological dimension in the sense of the meaning-making process. We all are in a continuum of making sense of the world. It's an endless inference of making explanatory hypotheses. That's sort of my pragmatist take, a la Peirce, on this. We have to make sense of our perceptions all the time. And what comes together here is sort of the application of rules that we already know, culturally determined, we've all learned that. But, then there's always this moment of, what is it really that I see? Because I can't really make sense of it immediately. Yeah. And this is the moment, this is the interesting moment that these movies really try to visualize, in that they draw our attention to this fact that we all have to make sense of the world, of our own perceptions all the time. But usually we're not conscious of it because, this happens like a continuous flow. We all do this all the time. Yes. But the movies then, and the artists, because they cannot, or they have great difficulties making sense of the world. And the movies really show this, try to visualize this. Sort of they draw our attention to this very moment. What are the rules in this unfathomable reality that we live in? Very often we can't really make sense of what we see. Yeah. We have to find rules instead of just applying them or, using them because we've learned them. But we have to come up with new explanatory hypotheses. And that's the moment, that the autistic personalities in a way do for us, and that these films try to stage. This moment of what in the world is going on here? What do I see? What are the rules? How do I communicate with the world? And also how do I make sense of my of the partner that I'm speaking with, my partner in conversation. So that's exactly what I speak about when I talk about the epistemological dimension that is being opened for us in these movies, and that's. Of course, and that requires a particular aesthetics, and that's the new take on this whole theory of representations of madness. That our attention is drawn to this epistemological dimension.
That This is fascinating, and let me ask just a brief final question, because you're talking about relatability, right? And the autistic is, of course, per se, the breakdown of relatability in a certain kind of way. And so let me just briefly conclude with a question about the return of the aesthetic as this conference envisions it, is how does your project relate to other more recent aesthetic theorizations, such as New Formalism that Caroline Levine, the conference participant, kind of lays out, or Sian Nai's affect theory? How does that relate, especially with regards to a certain form of relatability in our current age?
Yeah, a lot of research actually is being done right now. You can even say it's an explosion on this question of, how do we deal with autism, and also how do we make use of autistic worldviews in a way for opening new channels of communication for us. And for instance, the aesthetic categories that Nai speaks about, there is, a lot of follow-up on this, because the autistic personalities, in a way, they challenge these aesthetic categories. They put them into question, and they also question, what can I say, cognitive study scholarship, because they have these new perspective and this new take on aesthetic categories also. So that would be one part of my answer, but the other answer would be that we also have close connection to affect theory, because the body and the non-linguistic, in a way, forms of communication are suddenly brought again into to the focus, to the foreground. So that's another sort of context that this kind of representation opens. And as I said, there's a lot being done, and for some reason, autism, or the autistic worldview, in a way, has center stage these days. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. It's fascinating to see that, to follow up on that.
Fantastic. And I'm looking forward to reading more about it. But thank you, Susanne, so much. I think our time is up.
Thank you, Dustin.
It's great. Yet again.
Yeah, thank you.